Mhm.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think if you look at it as a family and together, there's always trade-offs. I mean, that's
Right.
there's never this like perfect, oh, and then I wanted this. And then, especially in the early days, it's the startup part of the marriage. Who's going to do
Mhm.
what and how can we make it work? But to me, I wouldn't say there's just this extra place of prioritization. I mean,
Mhm.
the house that I bought was built in 1977. The carpet was a disaster. We didn't have air conditioning. We had a swamp cooler. I mean, it gets up to 100 plus degrees Fahrenheit. Um, it just gets hot. And there were points when it was rough, and it was just like, but we were in this together. And my wife's like, well, we have to get AC now, and we have to do these things. It was, what do we do, and what can we suffer? What can we make work? I had a car that didn't have air conditioning, and my wife would take a spray bottle and spray the kids while she's driving, like just to keep them cool. And it was given to us by my parents. So you get into this like, and it was, I don't know, $500 car, you're like, well, it's great, but it sucked. And so it's kind of that, if you can delay um, delay my must haves a little
Mhm.
bit and look at it like, well, what do I want in the long term? And the longer I delay them, that can work.
Hello and welcome to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. We're here to help you navigate life while disrupting the status quo. Our discussions cover a number of topics relevant to everyday life. We discuss everything from relationships to entrepreneurship. We also engage in some difficult but important conversations. And now, here are your hosts, Brian and Tanya Hamilton.
Welcome to another episode of the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. Today we're joined by Aaron Shelley. Aaron, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, great to be here, Brian.
Awesome. Now, Aaron, let's start off by learning about you. Who is Aaron Shelley?
Okay, I would say, going back to high school, I always played sports, and then going through my education, I always liked to understand how things worked. I went into mechanical engineering, then I went into business. Got an MBA, an engineering degree, just because I like to understand how they work. And then once I figure out how they work, then I want to utilize that and actually be productive. So I've kind of gone through this process where now I understand engineering, then I understand the business side. And kind of the reason that I've gotten into this, where I'm at with this author thing, is I looked at the family and I'm like, I want to understand how the family works as well. And what are the dynamics we can play with? What are the levers we can pull? Because all families aren't the same. So that's kind of where I've been. I've been all over in the business world, done all sorts of things from software development, been an executive, been an investor, all over the map. So it's kind of who I am and where I'm at right now.
Great. So, in regards to looking at how the family works now, when did you start looking into that and researching into that?
I worked for a company. So I worked for Ancestry.com, a genealogy company. Then I jumped into a genealogy startup that we did 3 years. And then that kind of disappeared, as most startups do, just wasn't successful. And then I had this gap in my career where there was this opportunity to say, like, what am I interested in? And my mom had a connection to this professor at a university who was researching family and business. He was in the family business space. And so then he said, hey, you want to help me do some research? And I kind of am just an opportunistic guy. I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds interesting. So I helped him research his book. And in the course of doing that, I said, wait, there's this pattern that I'm seeing that looks a lot like business. I think you should rewrite your book, and wrote about 50 pages of how I thought it would be. And he responded with, that sounds like your book. Why don't you go write a book? So kind of had that done, and kind of got hijacked for a few years because of this other executive. I got caught up in another startup that did well. But then I'd say the other catalyst was, while I was working there, I had a friend my mom sent me this newspaper article that said one of my friends had been sentenced to life in prison for rape and attempted murder. And I thought, wait, what happened? Like, when you're right next to someone. He wasn't one of my best friends, but we played football. We went to the same church. We went to the same school. We were about the same socioeconomic status. So all those factors that people often, associate with crime or whatever outcomes just weren't true. So when that happened, I was like, what in the freak happened? Like, and how can I make sure this doesn't happen to my children? I don't know about you guys, but my children are where my most concern, energy, and when they're at risk, that's where I'm most focused. So that was kind of the major push into it.
Okay.
Now, as much as you're willing to share, can we talk about your family a little bit? Like how many kids you have, what kind of the age ranges are?
Yeah, so I have 4 kids. My oldest is 22. She's married. Then I have a 20-year-old son. He was going to school for computer science. And then I have 2 18 and a 16-year-old. They're both in high school. Looks like one of them is going to be a nurse, and another one is probably going to work in marketing. So
Nice.
that's kind of where the kids are. And like I said, I think my wife, we run an Irish dance business, so we have this constant flow of young kids. So it's kind of fun with the family. We always have these young kids coming in and making a lot more things interesting in your life than the normal calming effect as you get older, go through the young ages, and then you're like, oh, this is over. Nope, we still have all these little kids. So
Yeah.
it's kind of where we're at with the family.
Nice. And then that's really interesting business as well. So how did you get started in that? Like, it's, again, you've kind of been all over the map, but there has to be a story behind the Irish dance school.
Yeah. Well, so when I married my wife when I was still in college, and my wife she had got into Irish dance before river dance, if you're familiar with the river dance show.
Yep.
That was kind of this big craze in the kind of the late 90s. So then she kind of got into river dance. And then when we were in school, she actually taught at the university, developed the program for folk dancing there, for specific the Irish program. And then when I finished off my engineering, then my MBA, we had kind of the normal divergence of, okay, now I go look for a job, and then I move to wherever the job is, because that's what you're supposed to do. But I had read the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Many people have. Talks about you want assets. You don't want to buy, you don't just want to be in the rat race making a lot of money, but always in the rat race. So we came to this crossroads of, do we invest in the business and stay here because my wife at the time was the only certified Irish dance teacher in Utah? Or do I go to Portland, go to Intel, where I had a job opportunity, and work in marketing? So that was the choice. And my wife and I came together and said, she had played the cash flow game from Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And we were like, well, what do we want? Well, we want to have these. And so we actually bought a house with our studio, a building behind it that we converted into a studio, so she wouldn't have to commute. So we could all help out. It wouldn't have the additional costs. So that was about, it was at 2003 when we bought this house. And then we just were like, let's go full force into this. And luckily, we started, it has about 50 students. At one point we were over 200. Now we're kind of in the 150, 180 range, depending on the time of year. So yeah, it was this, that's why I kind of look at, there's like this business side. And even my wife, she is a great Irish dance teacher. She's great at all those things. But when it comes to technology, she hates it. So like, right. I do all the website, I do all the technology, I do all the CRM, I don't know if that's the same dynamic you guys have.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You got me on that one. It's funny how that goes. Right. And that's the nice thing about, having 2 people in a marriage is usually you find somebody's maybe stronger at the finances, or that's just like what they went to school for. Somebody's stronger in something else, and it all just sort of balances out. Right. And it does go back to that whole family business that, if 2 people aren't good at it, then somebody will usually take it on, do that research, learn, and then be able to take it from there. Right. Mm-hmm. But it is nice knowing, and I'm sure you could say the same thing, that your wife is the one that teaches everybody how to dance, and you don't have to worry about that. And she doesn't have to worry about the other things.
100%. Yeah. And and that's a little bit, I think, where a lot of my thought process came from. And I look at it and I'm like, if we were to start a business, you want 2 people in different, you want a salesperson and someone who's making product. You don't want 2 people making product, or you don't want 2 salespeople. And so I think it's been this weird dynamic in society where we've kind of tried to push everyone to do the same thing, right? Oh, it's a 50-50 relationship. You're like, if I started a business, if I interviewed for your company and said, yeah, I'll give 50%. I think you'd be like, okay, you're fine. Like, we're not hiring you. But yet a lot of people are like, the relationship needs to be 50-50. And you're like, mentally, it is, at least in most countries, as soon as you get married, it's literally a 50-50 partnership. But you can't approach it from that stance, just like you would approach a job being like, I'm going to give 100% and I'm going to do whatever it takes. To your point, Tanya, like, if you look at, somebody needs to figure it out. I don't care if you're not good at marketing. I'm not good at marketing. We need this in the company. So one of the two of us needs to do it. Right? That's startup life. And that's where you start to get into these dynamics where I think it's interesting to look in the business lens, where you have a lot of people and they're dating, they're trying to marry someone like them. And you're like, no, you want to find your complement. You don't want to marry someone who's just like you, because then you have all the same holes. So, I mean, and this is kind of where I looked at, you start to get into the comparison, I think, between the family and the business. In a business, we say you have a business model, right? That's how you're going to make money. That's kind of how you're going to survive. And that's really what's making the decisions. If you compare a company like Google versus Yahoo, at one point, Google was worth $1 million and Yahoo was worth like 90 billion. And now Google is, huge, and Yahoo's there. And you're like, well, what happened? It wasn't, they had more money. It wasn't the resources they had. It was the decisions that the companies were making. And that's all made in the business model. And so that's where I see there's a lot of people they don't think through the business model. How are we going to make money? How are we going to survive? Who's going to do the different jobs? Especially if you want to have a family, like, there's only one gender, whatever, that can actually have children, right? There's like, as much as I would want to, I can't have children. So there's some areas where we have to specialize just from a biological basis. And so then you kind of carry it through like, well, I love technology and learning about new stuff. Okay, then I can focus on, the cars and all the technology that our life and our taxes and all this garbage that sucks. I don't know about you, Brian. Maybe you're in Canada and it's just so much better with the tax system, but in the US, the taxes are. So that's kind of where you see this. I like to look at the whole thing, like, what is your business model and what are the things that are controlling how you're thinking about your family? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's actually interesting because we've talked about that too before, and we sort of have that same mind frame when it comes to like our family. And we've said, if you have a business, you meet, you have your strategic planning and all that kind of stuff. The same really should happen for a marriage. The same should happen for the family unit, right? Because, and some people may think, well, that's too like, corporate, or, scheduling these almost meetings, I guess, if you will, right? But if you don't have that, if you don't have conversations with your spouse about, where you would like to see your family, your finances, all that stuff, and the next X amount of time, well, what's going to happen? Like, nothing's going to actually happen, right? You have to sit down, you have to, like, we have whiteboards in front of us, and, you have to put things out and brainstorm, right? Like, so yeah, we totally agree with what you're saying.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is, I think we had this, if you look historically, if I'm a farmer, I have to have a farmer's wife. My grandfather was a potato farmer. He did some sheep farming. He had to have a farmer's wife who would also make the cheese and make some of the food and actually make clothing and then support him. Like, it was kind of a 2-person career to make the family work. And it seems like we've kind of pulled these apart, where now we're like, well, I hear a lot of people talk about, well, I'm strong and independent. Well, it's kind of like saying in a company, like, well, we're not hiring right now. We're great as we are. And then, so if you were going to interview with that person, going on a date, with them, you're like, what do you want me for? Well, I don't know. I'm strong and independent. I don't need you. There's no opening. And I think there's this weird psychology where it's like, what are you trying to achieve? Like, when companies merge together, which is kind of what we see in people, you start to go, why did you merge these companies? It had to have been because you thought that the whole would be greater than the sum of the parts. Like, you together could make something much better than just alone. Right. And we kind of see that in business as well. You see 2 founders tend to work better because you have someone, I call it emotional diversification, right? Where one person feels like crap and then you have someone else who hopefully doesn't feel like crap, or vice versa. So you can kind of get through some of those hard parts. But the thing, so like you were saying, that I like to go back to, so if you look at that business model in a family, if you look at it, or you can look at it at a company, there's a strategy, like how are we going to make money? And what's our mission? What's our purpose? What's our vision? Where are we going? You know, if I were going to start a company with you and I said, I want to start a legal company and you want to start an accounting company, we shouldn't get married. We shouldn't go into business. We don't have the same vision, right? And the same with the companies. And then the second part you have is the structure. What's your family structure going to be? Are you going to be married with kids, no kids? Are you going to cohabit? Are you going to live with your parents? Are you going to have your children live with you? You're like, there's all these dynamics around structure, and then also meetings. Do we have quarterly plannings? Do we have annual plannings? Do we have those type of things? And then the last piece is our culture. You know, like, do we have the same values and beliefs? You know, if I think there's no reason for me to try stuff, nothing's going to work out, then why would you want to go into business with me? Right. So there's this culture of, and it's interesting, you know, you guys have talked about it. It's like you're kind of moving through different opportunities, and it's like, what's the flexibility? What job am I going to do now? What job are you going to do? My wife at the Irish dance, there's sometimes she's like, St. Patrick's Day, I got the whole day with shows, and then I've got more shows. And then I'm like, okay, I'll go do the shopping this week, and I'll take care of the meals this week. So we have this flexible role system because it's like, it's not about, well, I'm sorry. And I've seen people do this. It's not my job. No, I'm not going to take out the garbage or help shovel the snow or whatever's there. That's not my job. And you're like, but we're in this together, aren't we?
Exactly.
So
yeah, no, and it's like it has to get done. So somebody's going to do it, and you continue and finish your thought, and then I'll jump back in.
well, yeah. So those are really the core key elements that I see. If you look at Google, their strategy is organize the world's data, and Walmart's strategy is to make things very profit or cheap for people, make it so they're affordable, I think is the word they use, right? That's their strategy. And then you have the culture of Walmart is very much, you need to come in on time. You have to follow the rules. You have to be very disciplined about people doing it, because if the stuff's not on the shelves, it's not going to work. Whereas with Google, they have high paid engineers. They're like, if you do your best work at 4 a.m., do it. And then you need to sleep and come in late, right? There's a lot more freedom in the Google environment than there is in a Walmart environment. And then, that's the structure. And then you look at the cultural elements. Well, that's culture. Then the structure, it's like very top down, how you pay people. There's very few people at Walmart who have equity, but at Google, you have those. So it's not about a right or a wrong business model, right? Just like in the business world, are you a SaaS company? Are you Gillette where you're selling razors? Like there's so many different, are you in advertising? So many different models. There's the same in families. It's not about the right model, period. If your spouse dies, sorry, you have some interesting problems, right? Mm-hmm. So it's much more about, is your strategy and your structure and your culture aligned in your family business model? Because if it is, then you get this circular, you make good decisions, and then you get more resources. And then the more resources you have, whether that's reputation, whether that's your relationships, whether that's your money, whether that's abilities, that kind of just circulates, and you become richer and richer, just like Walmart and Google. Like it took Walmart 20 years to build 1,000 stores. And then in 1 year, they were able to build 1,000 stores. Right. Yeah. So you see this, that's why I call it the flywheel effect. It's like, as you get this thing spinning, it starts to kick off more and more relationships and more money and more skills. And you start to see this, like, you look at Apple or Google, you're like, can you even stop the things now? There's so many people and so much money, and they have such a brand. Like, how are you going to stop that?
Oh, for sure. Now, I kind of want to circle back to one thing for anybody who's listening to this conversation that may not have a family yet, but wants one day. You hear people complain a lot about I guess the dating environment, right? So, what do you think are some of the challenges out there today? In most cultures, people do date before they get married. I guess some cultures that's not the norm, but in most cases, people do date. So, what would you see? What would you say are some of the major problems that we have today?
Well, I don't know if you've heard of the demographic problems that we have in some of the areas where we have a lot more educated women than we do educated men, and educated women usually want to marry educated men. So there's a smaller dating pool. So there's just, if 60% of women in some universities are getting a degree and there's only 40% men, that's 1/3 of the women there's no guy for. So there's some of those dynamics that are at play. I talk about those a little, but I think the bigger one is people are not understanding what the other person is looking for, right? I mean, I think for a lot of people, I've seen it a lot lately, more so with women, where they're like, I make my own money, I have my house, I have all my stuff, and then it's like, well, what are you going to do in the relationship? And it's like, well, I don't want to just have kids, I want to keep a job. And then the guys that they want to marry are like, but I want to have a family and have kids, right? So you end up with this weird dynamic of whose career is primary? Do you know what I mean? Like, if you were to get a promotion, and she was to get a promotion, do you follow both and then you split up the family and now you don't live by each other? Do you, if you had to go to New York or San Francisco, right? Do you disperse? Well, that's going to cause a huge amount of problems, right, in a family. Do you say, no, his career is the primary one, therefore we'll sacrifice her career? Or are you saying her career is primary, therefore we sacrifice his career? I mean, to some degree, I kind of experienced that in my own, where I said, we're going to build the Irish dance business. It did sacrifice my career, because I see people who went to Intel and then they climbed that ladder and then they kept working as exec these places. So I've kind of been through that sacrifice. It was to buy an asset. But I think that it's kind of like, well, some people will say, what are you bringing to the table? And it's like, but do you know what the guys you want to date want, or the girls you want to date want? And I've actually had a couple of women that I talked with. They reported to me at one point, and they were talking about, well, I'm not having all these trouble with these guys. And they were like, well, why? Well, I want this guy who's really strong, really executive, make us a ton of money, super driven. But I want to be that too. I want to be an executive. I want to be that. And I'm like, well, but then you also want to have kids, right? Well, yeah, I want to have kids, and then I want him to stay home. And I'm like, but you're saying you want the guy who's super driven to be an executive to stay home. Like, if you don't want to stay home, why do you think he wants to stay home? Like, so it's kind of this, do you really know what you're looking for? And in the two women I talked to one, and her husband actually wanted to be entrepreneurial. So then she was like, oh, or her boyfriend at the time. So then they were like, oh, it's a good dynamic if you have a steady job and then he can stay home with kids and do some of the entrepreneurial stuff and have that flexibility. So I think the big thing in the dating market is we're all trying to be like, look how much money I make. But then people are like, well, we don't need more money. I have enough money. What are you going to invest in your kids? Are you going to invest in the family? Are you going to what's your value system? And so I think that's kind of where you're hitting is it's kind of like, why would you merge two companies if you didn't need to?
Right.
That's actually there's a lot of people are getting, I mean, I got married when I was 21, which is pretty young. Right. And you look at people. So when I started, I was like in college. I think I spent the last $2,000 on my wife's ring, so this sounds a lot like a startup. You know what I mean? Like, we don't got any money. My wife was still in school. She had like a year left. So this was not hey, we're both flush and we both have all these structures and everything working through. It was, we're really starting ground level together. And I see it now if you wait until you're 26 or you're 30 or 35, you're like, going to our point, like you already have a strategy of how you're surviving. You already have structures in place. Yeah, I hang out with my guy friends here and I do these type of things here and blah, 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 blah. And I already have my culture and here's how I act. Well, now you're merging a company. And there was a friend of mine who actually had, I think, close to $1 million, but he wasn't married. And it's like, now when you're getting into a 50-50 relationship, only I'm bringing $1 million and you're not. Well, the dynamics are much different, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I was going to say there is something about growing and working together, right? Like we got not that young, but we got married
25 and 24.
Yeah. So, I mean, even that age in 2023 is considered young, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, we definitely weren't where we are now, like literally started from the bottom and just built, right? And there is something to be said about working together, being able to like also, how do you say? So it's not a competition, right? So like I had finished university, I pretty much went straight into my dream job, right? And Brian was still doing his thing and working, but I knew, and we always joke, I knew that he had that ambition and that he was going to get to where he wanted to go. So, and then it's like, okay, now I can take a step back and he go forward, right? So there is that back and forth. And I think sometimes if you do have two people who are trying to do the same thing, it turns into a competition.
Well, and it's like to your point, Aaron. If both of people are bringing the exact same thing to the relationship, they don't have anything to offer each other.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Well, and that's really where you're coming. Like you say, you were at the very early points in your career, and you're still in school. Like there's so many places where, I mean, my wife and I call it my three hells. Frankly, it was like, that first, when we invested in our house, I didn't have a job, right? And frankly, there weren't a lot of jobs for mechanical engineers with MBAs. Like that's a weird specialty, which is great if you work for Ford or some of these other companies, but not really in Utah at the time. So there was this first kind of hell, as I call it, where I was like, for 18 months, I had a job on and on, off again stuff. And I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing wrong. We weren't really in financial, I mean, I was under financial stress, but we always had enough money. Mm-hmm. And so going through that though, and there was points when relatives of mine were like telling my wife, hey, maybe you should leave your husband. Right. And my wife's like, no, I'm sticking through
it out.
Right. And so then there's this trust that I have with my wife from that. And then there was a point in 2007 when we invested in a real estate property. And I talked with her, we both agreed. And then it just went south. 2008, everything went bad. And my wife, I just felt like my job was the role. I was a provider. I'm trying to make the money, keep the family safe. And I'm like, I'm not protecting or providing for my family because of this. So I had really just a lot of criticism for myself. But my wife, again, she's like, we'll get out of this. And my parents helped me through, there's like this mental stress that comes. And then a few years later, 7 years, I got audited by the IRS, which is not a pleasant experience. Right. And again, it's just this, my wife and I went through those. So there's this whole side to me of like, my wife and I have a relationship and we trust each other, not because I'm like, well, you just have to trust. No, because she's proven and I've proven to be trustworthy. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the fun is, recently I made a lot of money to the point where I just had financial freedom where I'm like, now I can literally do whatever. But it wasn't me being like, look at me, I'm so big. Look at my wife. She didn't make all this money. It was like, no, this is what we did together.
Right.
Right. And that was, and there were points in there with the way we raised our kids and the amount of time that I spent with my kids because I had flexibility with jobs and stuff. I took advantage of gaps. And so it was this whole, like, we made this life together intentionally. And that was so fulfilling and continues to be that. But if you never take the risks and you never go through those hellish experiences, you also don't get the values and the value and the benefit out of it. Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, yeah. And when you have a start like that, the way I kind of sold myself was, hey, it's only going to get better.
Well, and this is an interesting point that you brought up is it sounds like, Tanya, the way you approached it was like, he will be, like you were kind of investing in him, right? I mean, if you looked at it as an investor, this is like, you're putting your money on this guy.
Yeah.
And it feels to me like a lot of women, especially, and a lot of men seem to blossom when they are under pressure. Like the number of guys that I've seen, they get married, and then they have a baby or they get their wife pregnant. And then all of a sudden you're like, dude, that guy just, what did he do? He turned on. And there's actually some literature. There's a book called The Female Brain and the Male Brain that talks about some of these changes. But you see that. So you see if you invest in this in the husbands often, then you see this like massive growth, because men tend to love, it's like weightlifting. We love weight on the shoulders. We hate the experience in some ways, but then you're like, dude, I'm ripped now. And that's where I feel like most guys can be, but it feels like a lot of women have now had this idea like, well, I don't need to invest. He needs to be kind of I'm only going to marry him once he's a doctor.
Right.
Not when he
has to be ready. Yeah.
Yeah. Which that, it makes it difficult to get married younger as well, because men generally, I think the number is 49 when they hit on average, when they hit their financial high point, right? So when you hit your stride financially, you're 49. If you're looking, an executive woman who's maybe in her late 20s, does she necessarily want to marry a 49-year-old guy who's gotten things established? So yeah, there's a lot of dynamics there. The other thing too, that a lot of women, for whatever reason, have this propensity towards men who are 6 feet tall, which I'm 6'3", so I didn't have a problem there. So I had at least one check box figured out in the beginning, right? But that's really 6 feet tall. I found this out the other day too. That's only 15% of men, right? So you want a top 10% income earner who is top 15 for height, right? So it's really narrowing the pool.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I'm 6'4". My wife's actually 6 feet tall, so she was like, I would really want to marry a guy who's smaller than or bigger than me, so I feel somewhat small. But yeah, the interesting thing is like I see this dynamic with, I had a relative, and he was a college dropout, screwed around, did skiing, played around, got married, got this woman pregnant. And then he just went on this massive spree of like working himself. Now it's 4 a.m. doing a paper route back in the day when that was a thing. And then he was working on electrician stuff. And then he was, just working. Then he got his contractor's license. Then he got his real estate license. The guy's worth, he's millions of dollars at this point. But if you looked at him at the time that his wife married him, you're like, college. I mean, I look at with my own kids. I'm like, I wouldn't want you to marry that type of that doesn't look like a strong future. Please don't bet on that. But then it's kind of this duality that you're like, well, I want the sure thing for my daughters, but was I the sure thing at the time? Oof. So it's an interesting dilemma, I think, that women have, frankly. It's but
and it, like, yes, sorry, you go on.
Well, it's also like, it also feels like if men don't get that extra burden, then they kind of just flail. They just spend their money, they spend their resources. It's not like they, you wait 20 years and then like, now I have so much money. It's like, well, they kind of spent it, or they wasted it, or they did those things. So there's a little bit where I think there was some number I was looking at, like tens of thousands of dollars men spend on women and activities around women and dating. And it's like, well, if you just catch that early in the 20s, whenever, all that's going to go into your wife instead of into the family, instead of just into the ether.
Yes, because it's an investment at that point.
Yes,
exactly. It's an investment in that relationship at that point.
Well, and that's part of what I look in the book is I talk about, you have this business model, and then it's a matter of you make those investments, and then you get, I break it into these categories of resources. I think there's a side where in Western, especially in the US, I don't know about Canada as much, but everyone's kind of, what's your measure is 100% based on your money. Well, how much money do you make? Well, that's one resource type that I talk about in the book. Your financial, your money, your tools, your property. But then there's another type of resource called your social resources. That's your relationships, your one-on-one relationships with people, your group relationships. If you're in a church or a sports group or anything like that, you have a relationship with that group. And then also your reputation. That's a second type of resources that I think is largely being ignored right now in society. And then you have the third type of resource, which is your human resources, which is your health, which is your time, and which is your abilities, right? So, you're in college, you're investing your time and money to get your abilities. You're then it's a circular thing. Now what are you going to do? Now you have a degree. Well, now I'm going to use my degree and my time. Now we're going to get more money. Okay, now you have more money. Now what? Well, maybe we'll have a kid. Okay, now we, right? You start to look at that process. And if you look at these, like in my family, my wife is kind of, I would say, like, we don't call it this, but she's like the HR director. She cares about the kids. She cares about their health. She cares about, making sure everyone's happy. She cares about the togetherness. She's the one who cares about the morale of the company or the family. It's not that I don't care, but I'm just less focused on it.
Sure.
Right. And so that's where I think, like, we've kind of lost. And there's also one that I just recently have thought about. When I came home from school, I would come home and my mom would be there. And I'd be like, here's what happened. Somebody kicked me in the face, blah, blah, blah. And then my mom would go through, well, why do you think she did that? Why do you think they did that? Why do you think the teacher? Right? And I was like, that is therapy, right? That is the therapy of the family, is the parent that's home and helping unpack whatever happened in their life, helping, here's how to react to it. Oh, you need to stand up to the bully. You need to do this type of thing. That's this therapy role. And now we see, like, when I was young, I knew virtually no one who was in therapy, right? Now it's like, seems like everyone's in therapy. And I'm like, well, if you've taken the therapist out of the family and you've taken the person, the person who's worried about the health of the family and the togetherness, well, it's no wonder that you're kind of outsourcing that to someone else, because no one has that responsibility in the family.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting you say that. Like we were talking at the beginning of the show, the job that I was doing before and for many years, it was very stressful. I was out of the home a lot. I enjoyed it, of course, and we were also in a position where it was something that I had to work, right? And we did eventually get to a position where I could step back from that. And now being home, yes, I work, but it's different. It's in the home. So I am there after school and stuff like that. And it's just that, like, catch 22, because we all understand that sometimes there's situations where both people have to work and it's outside of the home. Not everybody has that, right? But just what comes with that, you have a parent and the mother that is still expected to work her 9 to 5, but do all of that stuff you were just saying on top of that. And I remember after leaving my job and being home, and the days would pass and I'm exhausted. I'm like, how did I do all of this and all of that? But the reality is things had to give, right? Like, I wasn't doing my best in every role that I was doing. Like, there's just no way. There's no humanly possible way to do that. So that's the tough one, right? In our society where we're caught, that even if a mother would like to be home, it's not always an option.
Well, I think part of it too is that we kind of get sold this narrative that you need 2 incomes because you need all of this stuff, when really, when we broke it down, when I finally convinced you to stay home, because for the record, I did try with the first kid, not it took until the fourth, but but the amount of money that was being spent commuting and maintaining a vehicle, and then having to pay for childcare versus us having to outsource that versus doing it on our own. Like, really, the amount of money that job was bringing in was kind of negligible for what it was costing to be able to sustain that.
Yeah, well, and that's where I think if you look at it as a family and together, there's always trade-offs. I mean, that's right. There's never this like perfect, and then I wanted this, and then especially in the early days, it's the startup part of the marriage. Who's going to do what, and how can we make it work? But to me, there's just this extra place of prioritization. I mean, the house that I bought was built in 1977. The carpet was a disaster. We didn't have air conditioning. We had a swamp cooler. I mean, it gets up to 100 plus degrees Fahrenheit. It just gets hot. And there were points when it was rough, and it was just like, but we were in this together. And my wife's like, well, we have to get AC now, and we have to do these things. It was, what do we do, and what can we suffer? What can we make work? I had a car that didn't have air conditioning, and my wife would take a spray bottle and spray the kids while she's driving, just to keep them cool. It was given to us by my parents. So you get into this, like, and it was, I don't know, $500 car, you're like, well, it's great, but it sucked. And so it's kind of that, if you can delay delay my must-haves a little bit and look at it like, well, what do I want in the long term? And the longer I delay them, that can work. Even we had air conditioning up in the studio before we had it in our home, because we're like, that's making money.
Right.
This is going to make us a little more comfortable. And so it's really more to your point, you know, if it's never, there's always cases where it's not ideal. But I like what you said, Brian, when you're like, well, can you convince your wife? Like, can you look at your spending and be like, what here is worth it? And that's why I talk about the social relationship part. Is it worth it if you have $10 million and your kids hate you because you haven't spent the relationship with them, right? I mean, how many times do you see, it's like, what is it, a trope where you have the doctor who works so hard and then he ends up cheating with the spouse or with a secretary or someone else. You're like, was it worth it? Is that like at the end of your life, is there something more important than those relationships with your family, than your kids? And those are some of the places where I feel like you've just prioritized wrong because you didn't see that there were other resources available. Just like in a company, you're not like, we're just going to keep building the sales team. We're just going to keep spending all our money on the sales team. It's like, well, no, you need to spend money on the accountants and you need to spend money on the product. It's always a balance. And if you get focused on just one, you get out of balance, you waste money, right? And that's kind of what I see in families. So it's really, and I even say in life, there were some crappy things that I did, but they kind of were together either with my wife or even before my wife, when I was like, this is going towards my goals. So even though I was cleaning toilets and washing dishes at this big family, 300 dishes a meal, you're like going through it. It still was purposeful and meaningful because it went with my mission. Right. And so that's, to me, is like a lot of people I feel like are like, I hate my job. Well, why? Well, because it just sucks and I have to do stuff. Yeah. Every job's like that. There's no job that's like, unless someone has it, where you go and the whole thing is just, unicorns and rainbows and lollipops the whole time. And you're just like, I'm amazed that they pay me for this.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't found that job myself that will just pay you what you want to do whatever you want to do. It's odd, right?
Well,
it's odd people want
you
that.
even see some of our professional athletes, and movie stars, and you're like, yeah, that movie star is spending 6 months or a year away from, they have to be on set. And this athlete is every single week, they're in a different city, like playing, and then during certain times, and then, oh, hey, they got traded from this team to this team, move. Like you look at this and there's this glorification of some of these lives. And then if you actually look into the logistics of it, I mean, like, I love Elon Musk and all he's done with SpaceX, but I don't think I want his family life, right? I mean, he's got 10 children with 4 different women. He doesn't, I love and appreciate everything he's doing in terms of, I mean, I'm an engineer. That's everything he does is super sexy. Aerospace, electric cars. But there's a side of, that's not the trade-offs that I want to make. You want to trade off your family. I've seen people do it. They trade, I have a friend and the dad is making money, the mom's making money, they have 7 kids, and the kids are kind of going their own ways. And you look at that and you're like, is that a trade-off that I want to make, or do I value my kids more? So that's the type of thing when, I mean, it sounds like you two have done a lot of this trading off and working together as a unit to make your family better. And I don't know, is it not super satisfying to you?
Oh, it is. Like, it's funny because even just this morning, it not all Mondays are like this, but everybody was ready and we were sort of like just all hanging out together. It was only 5 minutes or so, and everybody was ready, so there was no like, go get this or go get that. And as I was there, I'm just sort of thinking like, wow, there was a lot that we had to give up or change along the way, but like not having to run out the door before the kids and stuff like that. Like, those are the sacrifices, and, to each their own, but it's like, okay, it's so worth it to all be here in this moment before everybody heads off for the day. Right. So I think the other piece with that is the whole, what you want to prioritize. Right. So and not looking and focusing on other families and other businesses, right? As you would say, and really just focusing on what it is you want for your family, because we all know it's going to be different. And we don't know what the family down the street has to give up, or, what it is that they do to have what they have, and vice versa, right? So yeah, I think that's a big one. It's hard, especially in this day and age, to not look on social media and different things like that. But yeah, just really focus on what it is that your family wants.
Okay. But Aaron, you actually as well made a really great point about the trade-offs. I think it was Thomas Sowell who's quoted as saying, there's no there's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? Everything you do has some kind of ramification to it. And I think as a society, we've just come to think that, we come up with a solution and that's it. But there's always something else. We'll suggest sometimes the government needs to step in and fix something and fund something. But okay, great. Where's that money coming from? It's going to increase taxes, right? It's going to, we want to raise minimum wage. It's going to increase the cost of everything. So there's always these trade-offs, and like you've kind of mentioned, it applies to a family as well.
Yeah, well, and I think there's an interesting political thing that I talk about in the book. If you look at a business model is I take action, then based on my action, I maybe make more money, and then now I can do more of that thing, right? Google, I'm going to make search better, and I'm just going to keep doing this. But if you look what happens when you start to get a lot of government programs, I do nothing, then the government gives me money. Well, that's a business model. Right. But I can't double down and do twice as much nothing. I can't do 3 times as much money and just keep doing that. So there's a side where it's like, you don't want to get people caught in business models as the government that you don't actually want long term. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit, it's kind of like you were saying, Tanya, and another thing, it's a catch-22. You want to help people who need it. But if you help people who need it, then that's what their kids grow up with. And I think there's some interesting cases where a lot of people in our society are growing up as single parent households. And we want to support, we don't want them to just be like, oh, you're single, screw you. But then there's another side where it's going to be very difficult for those children to be married because they don't know how to. They don't see, your kids are seeing you make all these trade-offs, and they're seeing, well, what does mom do? And what does dad do? And how do they react? And how do I work with a partner? If you never work with a partner and then all of a sudden you get into, there's definitely this gravity that pulls, men and women together. But then if you get into that, you're like, well, screw you. I didn't want this. Well, you the whole negotiation and those type of things. It's that you want to help people, but in the course of helping, you don't want to incidentally hurt them and perpetuate that thing. So that's the kind of the catch-22 that I see with some of the government programs is it's like, well, how do you help without long-term hurting, right? And so, and that's where you see in the family too, well, I want to give my kids, I was so poor. I see this a lot. I was so poor growing up. I want to give my kids more and I want to give them things. But then your kids are learning, if I do nothing, people with money will give me money, give me stuff, and then I'll be fine. And that's what you see a lot of, trust fund babies. That's their business model. So it's this interesting catch-22 in some cases. And we're just going through the thinking, especially as a parent, yes, I want to give my kids certain things, but I don't want to take away their learning and that feeling of wanting something, working towards it, then accomplishing it. Right. So that's the parenting side that I think is complex too, because, well, I'm going to give them an allowance. Well, for what? Is that universal basic income for families? You're like, well, is that what we're teaching them? And so I think a little bit that's what we're playing with is, well, what is the value system you're trying to teach your kids? Are you trying to teach them? It sounds like you both made some good choices. We're working hard. How are you perpetuating that with your kids?
Yeah, they don't get an allowance. They have to earn their money, right? We provide everything they need. They go to a private school, so yeah, if they want anything on top of that, they need to work for it.
Yeah.
that's that's the model we came up with.
Yeah, and it's funny because even like for our oldest, right? Like now he's babysitting, so we are in a like that sweet spot when it comes to the kids and their ages, and he's like, "Do I get paid for this?" So we came up with a rule where like, listen, if we are going out for like appointments, business, like all that kind of stuff, no, you're not getting paid. You're just helping us out so we can get what we need to get done. If it's like for a social thing, dinner out, like something like that, sure, you'll get a few bucks, but just know that we're not paying you like another babysitting job. That's for sure. Right. So
yeah, it's an interesting dynamic with parenting and that's where I go back to, if you look at a company, there's always a group when you join the company that they onboard you, right? Here is your training. Here's how you get through. Here's the jargon we use. Usually have a mentor, right? That's what we have in companies. If they're good. I mean, I've been in companies where you get in and you're like, holy cow, what are we doing? I don't know. Yep. The guy who was doing something, he left. So you have to do it, right? But normally you have this onboarding group. And if you look in, the families are the onboarding groups of our society. Right? You guys have put together a successful family. Now it's like, can you onboard, teach the kids the values, teach the kids those things. And if you do it well, then the kids come out and they're like, I understand the complexities of the culture, of the law, of all these things they need to, and they can become productive citizens pretty easily. But if you counter that with some of these kids who don't have a parent, or, there's all sorts of alcoholism, drugs, all these things. If your parent is in that state, you're really in a rough space because you're not getting onboarded, you're not getting trained. And even if you were getting trained by that parent, they're not very effective. Mm-hmm. So it's this interesting case where I see like, who's onboarding the kid? And we try to do that with school, but school is like, we try to like, I've found that in the US, I've seen a lot of people complain at how bad the schools are, but all the schools where people have good business models, the schools also teach those same values. Like my schools, all the public schools were great. They were fine because they all taught what the parents kind of wanted taught. And so it was 100%. And it sounds like you guys have a private school. So you're like, here's what we want taught to our children. Therefore, we're going to put our kids in that value system, right? But that's the problem when you get into this incongruency of, I'm sending my kids to learn values that I don't actually value, right? There's this conflict then. Like, do you need to learn calculus? Maybe not for some business models, not for some careers, right? Do you need to learn English? Do you need to learn Spanish, like different languages? There's this huge thing of what we're trying to push in the schools. And if the parents support it, seems to work pretty well. But when you have the parents that are like, I didn't do that. Here's what my thing was. It's a conflict. And then you start to say, well, these schools suck. It's because you're trying to have the schools indoctrinate different values than the parents are teaching. Yeah. So I don't know. That's kind of the interesting thing that I've seen when you think about government and when you think about the family is it's like, are they teaching the things that are helping your business model? If my school system, if my kids went to a school and they're like, you're going to be a professional athlete, you're going to be amazing. I'd be like, we got to get you out of there because this is, I mean, I'm 6', I played football. I'm 6'4". I probably could have played college football. I mean, I stopped in mid-high school because I was like, man, I'm going to jack up my body and I'm going to make my money with my brain. Like, but if you see like this, I call it the superstar career where we're pushing people towards this like low probability of success career. It's like 0.1% of high school athletes make it to the pros. And you're like, I mean, if you go and study engineering, I don't know, it's like 99% chance.
Chances are way higher.
You're in daycare and healthcare stuff. You go into those, it's like, okay, your chance of success is high 80s, 90s. I don't know. Maybe even 100%. So it's kind of like, why do we push our kids to be actors and be athletes and be these superstars when we ourselves aren't living that same life? We're like, but they could be on TV, but they could be amazing. Right? Is it worth it? And are they really going to make it? Or will they end up with a lot of broken dreams and issues because they didn't learn things well? So I don't think you should. It's just kind of like, why are we pushing everyone towards business models that I don't think really apply to them?
Now, I want to dive in a bit to the book, Family Flywheel. Now, the things that we've talked about so far, structure, strategy, and culture. Now, for those who maybe don't have the business background and haven't worked through these exercises, how do you apply these principles to a family?
Well, so if I look at it, I have some worksheets that if you go to the familyflywheel.com, you can kind of go through, and the book kind of walks through a few of the questions. But at a high level, it's like, I think the main thing of the strategy is, what do you think your mission in life is? It changes. I've been at a lot of companies and the missions change over time, but what do you think it is? What is your purpose? If you're religious, it may be attached to your religion or to your connection to God, however that is. So that is kind of your strategy. And then you kind of back into, well, okay, how am I going to make money? I mean, that's an important part for any family, or, how am I going to feed myself really and feed my family? So that's really the basis of strategy. And there's a few things I talk about, like, are you going to be white collar, blue collar? There's different cultures. Are you going to go into the military? There's like a few different areas that way. That's the basis of a strategy. Then you get into structure, which is, how are you going to structure your family? Like, do you want to live with your parents? You see a lot of immigrants will live in what I call the extended family business model, right? Their parents are here, then they live with their parents. They have multi-generational. For whatever reason, the West has said, hey, that's not good generally. But if you look, it's actually quite effective. I mean, I lived with my in-laws for a little bit. So it's like, what structure do you have now? What ones do you want in the future? And there's not really that many. And then I think the bigger one is really the culture, kind of along the lines of, what are your values? Like, do you believe in delayed gratification? Do you believe in, have you like growth mindset versus fixed mindset? I think I saw one of your podcasts that was on that, right? What are your beliefs? Do you believe you're a victim, or are you fundamentally an actor? I mean, we all go through stuff. I talked about my financial issue. I could have blamed the bankers. I could have blamed the people, but I'm like, hey, it's on me, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter who I blame. So it's kind of, what are your beliefs, and are they good? So if you kind of walk through those, and then you can kind of see, are they aligned? Are there issues? I want to be a doctor, but I want to get married young, and I want to live a fat life. I want to enjoy my life when I'm young, go on cruises. Well, that's going to be rough. And you don't have delayed gratification, right? That's what I'd say. Good luck. It's a 9-10 year commitment with a lot of work and a lot of effort. You probably don't want to go down that path if you don't have those values. So a little bit's like, if you look at it as an individual before you get married, even after you're married, it's like, individually, what's your mission? What's your purpose? And then you look at your spouse, have the same exercise done. And then you look at them together, like, are we conflicting? I've seen some. There was one woman I know, she was like, my family went on cruises every year, so that's important. We need to go on cruises every year. And this guy's like, geez, that's a lot of money. Right? I don't value that. And so it's like, there's some of those conflicts. So, and then the other piece of structure I would say is that roles and responsibilities. Do I want to be a mother? Do I want to stay home with the kids? Even if I can't, what roles? Am I going to be the one who makes the food, or I'm going to be the one who controls the health? Am I going to be the provider and the protector? It's really kind of just thinking through things a little bit. It's kind of like if you start a business, you have the same piece of, how are we going to make money? Okay, you're going to make the money. Okay, now who's going to do the other stuff? It's really just kind of being a little bit thoughtful as you go through the list of, it's snowing. You guys said it's snowing where you're at. Well, who's going to go clear it? How is it going to, are you going to pay someone to do it? Is it something that, one of you is going to do? Is it something your kids are going to do? All those roles and responsibilities are just kind of the logistics. And then I think there's also a place where you can look at it and be like, am I successful right now? Like, if you look at your own business model and you're like, I look in the bank every single day or every month or year, we're not making any more money than we were, and our investments aren't going up. And you go like, we should probably change something about our business model, because it's not growing. So I think it's much more like, and there's some exercises. I mean, there's so many things that people value. Do you value your faith? Do you value freedom? Do you value independence? Do you value drive? If you go through it, there's so many different values that it kind of going through that exercise and thinking, what are my values, helps you think through the trade-offs, I think, like we were talking about. Well, if I had to give up family time versus money, oh, okay. If I have to give up, you know, I'm just trying to think through the others where you could say, how do I weigh these against themselves and say, these are the most important? And if I'm saying, no, the most important thing for me is my family, then okay, like you said, we'll make sacrifices. We'll go on, my wife always says, bean and rice diet, you know, like we'll figure it out. So it's really just being, just like in a business, you'd have to go through and be like, okay, we want to sell this. Okay, first we got to get it onto Amazon. Then we're going to get an order in. We have to have an email for them. There's so many little logistics that I don't think people really think through. And then I don't know how your marriage was, but the first year of my marriage with my wife, it was a lot of fights around and conflict around who's doing what and what are the expectations, because it was just working through all the logistics.
Yeah.
Right. And you look at it like, why were we fighting about who takes out the garbage or who does this or how many, you look at it in retrospect, it seems so silly, but it's really just, what are your expectations of me? What are my expectations of you? So but I think if you have the core business model and you get aligned on the vision and the mission as a couple, right? I mean, if there's the book, like, I'm trying to remember the quote who it was from, but he said, when you have a why, you can always find a how, right? It's like, once you have a purpose, it's really easy to find solutions. But if you don't have that underlying, if you're not together as a couple on where you want your family to go, at some point you'll probably splinter. Mm-hmm. And so it's really like, I think they call it like visioning out, looking at your heads, like when you die, what do you want people to say about you? That's an important thing to think through for both the people in the relationship. Because if you look at that and you're like, yeah, we're aligned. Here's what we want. Here's what we want for our kids. Here's what we want for our families. I mean, we can't take anything with us when we die. So it's much more like, why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. So yeah, and then I would say the interesting, and I'd say the most sad thing that I've seen, there was a guy who, he was a high-level executive. He ended up dying from some medical complication, and his insurance policy paid out $20 million to his daughter, who was 20 or 18. She ended up, she's on her fourth or fifth marriage, right? She's bought and sold companies and actually had to get loans from her mom. So it's kind of like, it's such a sad thing when all of the work you do as parents ends up hurting your children, Yeah. Like, it's like, but I did everything so this wouldn't happen. Like, right. And now it's happening. How frustrating and sad.
Absolutely. Now, I always like to take the opportunity to take our guests really their hindsight and be able to hopefully help someone make that their foresight. So if you were able right now to sit across the table from 21-year-old Aaron, what wisdom that you have now would you impart to him?
What wisdom would I impart to me? There's a side where I think it would have been be more holistic. I was so focused on financial, and I think a lot of men get caught up in that, especially when you start into a new family. It's like, how are we going to make this work? And so if you start from a holistic, no, we have financial resources, we have social resources, and we have human resources. Look at it holistically and be patient, right? Just like Walmart, you're not going to build 1,000 stores in one year until you've gone through 20 years of it. It's the same thing. Like, it's going to be a little bit of a slow burn, but if you focus on building relationships, building relationships and your health and your time utilization, as well as the financial, if you look at it holistically, you'll make better trade-offs and you'll have a much more it'll be a lot less emotional for you because the ups and downs will be mitigated. You'll say, yeah, I may not have a lot of money, but I have the relationship right now, and we're on track to go where we want to go.
Excellent. Well, Aaron, before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that we tell everybody about the book. So it's called The Family Flywheel. And if I was accurate in this, the website is thefamilyflywheel.com. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Of course,
yep.
all of it.
Yeah. So the book looks like this. I try to have that circular thing because I'm like, this is a circular thing where you put money in, you put time in, you put effort in, and you'll get more. And then you'll have more money and effort and time, and you'll get this whole compounding interest in your relationships, right? You get good relationships, it'll compound. You get good money, you'll get more money. You have good skills, more people will want to hire you. It's this, there's so many of these reinforcing cycles that I for sure didn't see. When I was young, it was save, save, save to get rich. And then I was like, that doesn't help. Then I read Rich Dad Poor Dad, and I'm like, oh, it's a system. Buy assets, get money, the assets give you income. The income gives you cash flow. The cash flow gives you, oh my gosh, I understand how it works. And so I think my book is really just that expansion of that. Like, look at it holistically, and you will be able to make much better trade-offs, especially in families. So yeah, the Family Flywheel, thefamilyflywheel.com, the book's on Amazon. I'm on LinkedIn. Also Facebook. So any of those places, contact me. And I'd love to talk to people. It's I'm at this place where I'm more like, I really want to help people, give people anything I've learned. So hopefully you can be the next generation of more successful than I am. I don't want us to get in this negative spiral of failure. I'm like, we should be learning from each other, getting better. I want my kids to do better. I think you probably do too. It's like, I want my kids to be richer than me. So that's kind of where I see it as generationally. If we teach the good principles we learned, our children will be more successful than we will. And hopefully our society will be more successful.
No, absolutely. 100% agree. All right. Well, Aaron, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Thank you just for making the time and sharing so much of your knowledge with us.
Yep. No problem. I appreciate it. Thanks for allowing me to come on your show.
Awesome. Well, for everyone who watched or listened to this episode, thank you for letting us disrupt your everyday.
Thanks for listening to the Disrupt the Everyday podcast. For more ways to listen, connect with us on social media. To be a guest or to partner with us, check out our link tree at Disrupt the Everyday. Join us next time for more ways to disrupt the everyday.
Bye.